Billionaire dates a fast food cashier. The secret she's hiding changes everything. Dylan Cole stepped out of his sleek black town car, his polished Oxfords clicking against the marble steps of the towering glass office building. His day had been a relentless series of meetings, negotiations, and decisions that barely left room for a breath. His assistant, Rebecca, trailed behind him, rattling off reminders about upcoming calls and documents requiring signatures. "Mr. Cole, the Zurich deal is moving forward, but there's a snag with the third-party clause. Legal needs your approval to proceed," Rebecca said, her tone crisp and efficient. "Of course there's a snag," Dylan muttered, loosening his tie as they walked. "That deal's been nothing but headaches." As they entered the building, employees nodded and smiled nervously at Dylan, their CO. He barely noticed. His focus was already shifting to the next problem, the next move. It was how he'd always operated, thinking 3 steps ahead, never pausing long enough to take in where he was. But today was different. Something gnawed at him, an unfamiliar sensation he couldn't quite shake. It wasn't the Zurich deal or the mounting pressure from his board. It was something deeper, something he wasn't used to confronting, a hollow, gnawing emptiness that all the wealth in the world couldn't seem to fill. By the time his meeting concluded, it was late afternoon. Rebecca offered to have lunch brought up, but Dylan waved her off, deciding to step out for a change of scenery. He rarely ventured out for meals, preferring the privacy of his office, but today he craved something, anything to break the monotony. He wandered aimlessly through the bustling streets of downtown, his tailored suit setting him apart from the sea of casual pedestrians. He passed a row of high-end restaurants, their sleek interiors visible through glass facades, but none appealed to him. Then, almost on a whim, he stopped in front of a small fast food joint. Its neon sign flickered faintly, and the smell of grease wafted through the air. It was the kind of place Dylan hadn't set foot in since college, but something about its unassuming nature drew him in. The contrast to his usual world of luxury felt oddly inviting. Inside, the place was buzzing with activity. Customers lined up at the counter, while employees darted between the kitchen and the dining area, their movements efficient and hurried. Dylan scanned the room, taking in the chaos, when his eyes landed on her. She stood behind the register, her brown hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. Her uniform was plain, and her expression was one of quiet concentration as she counted change for a customer. There was nothing extraordinary about her at first glance, but something about the way she carried herself, the calm amidst the chaos, caught Dylan's attention. "Next," she called, her voice clear and steady despite the noise. Dylan found himself stepping forward, almost on autopilot. She looked up, her brown eyes meeting his briefly, before flicking back to the register. "Welcome. What can I get for you?" she asked, her tone polite but indifferent. Dylan glanced at the menu, realizing he hadn't even thought about what to order. "Just a burger and fries," he said. "Any drink with that?" "Water's fine," he replied. She punched in the order, her movements quick and efficient. "That'll be $7.85. Dylan handed over a crisp $20 bill, watching as she made change. "Keep the rest," he said, his voice low. Her eyes flicked up to his, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she nodded. "Thank you." He took his receipt and stepped aside to wait for his food. But as he stood there, he couldn't help but glance back at her. There was something about her, an air of resilience that seemed to set her apart from the harried employees around her. He found himself wondering what her story was, what had brought her here. When his number was called, Dylan took his tray and sat at a small table near the window. He picked at his food absent-mindedly, his attention drifting back to the cashier. She moved with practiced efficiency, her focus unwavering as she handled orders and resolved minor customer complaints. She wasn't smiling, but there was no bitterness in her demeanor, just a quiet determination that intrigued him. As the rush began to die down, she stepped away from the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. Dylan saw his chance and acted on impulse. "Excuse me," he said, catching her attention as she passed his table. She stopped, her brow furrowing slightly. "Yes, I just wanted to say, you're very good at what you do," Dylan said. The words sounded awkward even to his own ears, but he pressed on. "You keep things moving smoothly, even with the chaos." Her expression softened, and a faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Thanks. It's just part of the job." "Still," he said, leaning back in his chair, "it's impressive." She nodded, her smile fading slightly. "Is there anything else you needed?" Dylan hesitated. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to accomplish, but something in him didn't want the conversation to end. "What's your name?" he asked. She looked at him warily, her guard clearly going up. "Emma." "Emma," he repeated, testing the name. "I'm Dylan." Her eyes flicked to the expensive watch on his wrist and the tailored cut of his suit. She said nothing, but he could see the wheels turning in her mind, trying to place him. "Well, Dylan," she said finally, "if there's nothing else, I should get back to work." "Of course," he said, nodding. But as she walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than met the eye. Over the next few days, Dylan couldn't stop thinking about Emma. It wasn't just her composure or the way she seemed to stand out in the chaos of the fast food joint. It was the mystery surrounding her. Her guarded demeanor and the quick, calculating way she assessed him had left an impression he couldn't shake. On a whim, he found himself returning to the restaurant. This time, he made sure to time his visit for the late afternoon, when the lunch rush had subsided. He told himself it was to grab a quick bite, but deep down, he knew he was hoping to see her again. Sure enough, she was there, wiping down tables near the counter. Her uniform was the same, but today her hair was loose, falling in soft waves around her face. She didn't notice him at first, her focus on her work, but when she looked up and saw him, her expression shifted, surprise quickly masked by her usual calm. "You're back," she said as he approached, her tone neutral. Dylan smirked, leaning casually against the counter. "What can I say?" The service was unforgettable. Emma rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress the faint smile that tugged at her lips. "Let me guess, burger and fries again." "You're good," he said, "but maybe I'll switch it up this time." "Surprise me." She raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. Coming right up, as she prepared his order, Dylan leaned against the counter, watching her work. He noticed the way she moved, efficient, deliberate, but with a certain grace that seemed out of place in such a hectic environment. She was younger than he'd first thought, probably mid-20s, though her demeanor carried a maturity that suggested she'd seen more than her fair share of life's challenges. When she handed him his tray, he gestured toward an empty table. "Join me for a minute?" Emma hesitated, glancing around the restaurant. "I'm on the clock." "Consider it part of the service," Dylan said with a grin. She sighed but followed him, sitting down across from him. "I only have a minute," she said, folding her hands on the table. "That's all I need," he replied. "I wanted to ask, how long have you been working here?" "About a year," she said, her tone cautious. "Why?" "Just curious. You don't seem like the type to stick to one place for long." Emma's gaze hardened slightly, her guard going up. "And what type is that?" Dylan raised his hands in mock surrender. "I didn't mean it like that. You just seem like you're meant for more." Her expression softened slightly, though suspicion lingered in her eyes. "Not everyone has the luxury of chasing more," she said quietly. Her words struck a chord in Dylan. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like her. But instead of feeling defensive, he found himself intrigued. "Fair point," he said after a pause. "But that doesn't mean you shouldn't want it." Emma shrugged, glancing toward the kitchen. "I should get back." "Wait," Dylan said, leaning forward. "Let me take you out. Dinner, drinks, your choice." Emma blinked, clearly caught off guard. "You're serious?" "Absolutely," he said. "No strings, no expectations. Just dinner." She hesitated, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. "I don't know." "Come on," Dylan said, flashing a disarming smile. "What's the worst that could happen?" Emma laughed softly, shaking her head. "Fine. One dinner. But don't expect me to be impressed." Dylan grinned, already planning where to take her. "I wouldn't dream of it." A few nights later, Dylan picked Emma up in front of her modest apartment building. She stepped outside wearing a simple black dress that hugged her figure, her hair tied up in a sleek ponytail. She looked stunning, but it was the look of uncertainty in her eyes that caught Dylan's attention. "You clean up nice," he said as she slid into the passenger seat of his car. Emma smirked. "You're not so bad yourself." They drove in comfortable silence, the city lights reflecting off the sleek black exterior of Dylan's car. He took her to a quiet rooftop restaurant with sweeping views of the skyline. The ambience was elegant but understated, a stark contrast to the chaos of her daily routine. Over dinner, they talked about everything and nothing. Dylan shared stories about his upbringing, how he'd built his empire from scratch, and the pressures of being at the top. Emma listened intently, occasionally interjecting with her dry humor that kept him on his toes. But when the conversation turned to her, Emma grew more reserved. She answered his questions politely but vaguely, deflecting when he probed too deeply into her past. "You're a tough one to figure out," Dylan said, leaning back in his chair. Emma shrugged, her eyes flicking to the city skyline. "Some things are better left unsaid." Dylan frowned, sensing the weight behind her words. "Fair enough. But if you ever feel like sharing, I'm a good listener." She offered him a small, almost sad smile. "I'll keep that in mind." As the evening wore on, Dylan found himself more captivated by Emma than ever. There was a depth to her, a quiet strength that both intrigued and unsettled him. He couldn't help but wonder what she was hiding and why. When he dropped her off that night, Emma hesitated before getting out of the car. "Thanks for dinner," she said, her tone softer than usual. "Anytime," Dylan replied. "You know how to reach me." She nodded, her hand lingering on the door handle. "Good night, Dylan." "Good night, Emma." As she disappeared into the building, Dylan sat in his car for a moment, staring at the empty seat beside him. He had a feeling this was only the beginning, and he couldn't wait to see where it led. The next morning, Dylan sat in his office, unable to focus. The numbers on his screen blurred as his thoughts drifted back to Emma. Her guarded demeanor, the way she seemed to deflect any questions about her past, only fueled his curiosity. There was something about her that didn't add up, but he wasn't sure if he wanted to uncover her secrets or if he simply wanted to understand her. Rebecca, his assistant, knocked lightly on the door before stepping in. "Mr. Cole, the Zurich team is online too. They're waiting for your approval to move forward." Dylan waved her off distractedly. "Tell them I'll call back in 15 minutes. Rebecca hesitated, a rare flicker of concern crossing her usually composed face. "Everything all right, sir?" "Fine," Dylan replied, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. Rebecca nodded and left without another word. Dylan sighed, leaning back in his chair. This wasn't like him. He wasn't the type to lose focus, especially not over someone he barely knew. But Emma wasn't just anyone. She had a way of getting under his skin, making him question things he'd never given a second thought. By the time he left the office that evening, Dylan had made up his mind. If Emma wasn't going to open up to him willingly, he'd find another way to understand her. Emma's days at the restaurant continued as usual, though she couldn't ignore the subtle shift in her routine. Dylan's presence had unsettled her in ways she hadn't anticipated. His charm, his confidence, his curiosity, it all felt too close, too personal. She wasn't used to people like him, people who seemed genuinely interested in her for reasons she couldn't fully grasp. One afternoon, as she finished her shift, she stepped outside to find Dylan leaning casually against his car. He looked out of place against the backdrop of the rundown neighborhood, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the chipped paint and cracked pavement around him. "Stalking me now?" she asked, crossing her arms as she approached him. "Just happened to be in the area," he replied, his smirk betraying the lie. "Thought I'd see if you wanted to grab a coffee." Emma sighed, shaking her head. "You're persistent, I'll give you that. Is that a yes?" Dylan asked, tilting his head. She hesitated, glancing around as if weighing her options. "Fine, but just coffee." Dylan opened the passenger door for her, and she slid in reluctantly. They drove in silence to a small cafe on the edge of the city. It was quieter than the bustling chains Emma was used to, with warm lighting and mismatched furniture that gave it a cozy charm. They found a corner table, and Dylan ordered for both of them without asking, surprising Emma with his choice of her usual, a simple latte with no sugar. "How do you know?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. "Lucky guess," he said with a shrug, though the twinkle in his eye suggested otherwise. As they sipped their drinks, Dylan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "So, Emma, are you going to tell me what you're hiding?" Emma's smile faded, her grip tightening on her cup. "I'm not hiding anything." "Come on," Dylan said, his tone light but probing. "You deflect every time I ask about your past. You're careful with your words, your actions. It's like you're afraid of slipping up." Emma's jaw tightened, and she set her cup down carefully. "Not everyone's life is an open book, Dylan. Some of us have reasons for keeping things to ourselves. And some of us want to help if we can," he countered, his voice softening. She looked away, her gaze fixed on the window. For a moment, she considered telling him everything, a truth she'd carried for years. But the thought of opening that door, of letting someone like Dylan into her world, terrified her. "You wouldn't understand," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Try me," Dylan said, his tone steady. Emma shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. It's not that simple. Dylan studied her, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. He wanted to push, to peel back the layers she kept so carefully guarded, but he knew better than to force it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, giving her the space she seemed to need. "All right," he said, his voice lighter. "I'll let it go. For now." Emma glanced at him, her expression softening. "Thanks." The days turned into weeks, and their connection deepened despite the walls Emma tried to keep up. Dylan found himself drawn to her in ways he couldn't explain, while Emma struggled to reconcile her growing feelings with the secret that weighed heavily on her. One evening, as they walked through the city after dinner, Dylan turned to her, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "You're not like anyone I've ever met, Emma." She laughed softly, though there was a trace of sadness in her voice. "I'll take that as a compliment." "I mean it," he said, stopping to face her. "You make me question things, my choices, my life. You make me want to be better." Emma looked up at him, heart aching at the sincerity in his words. She wanted to believe in him, in the possibility of something real between them, but the weight of her secret loomed large. "Dylan," she hesitated, her throat tightening. "There's something I need to tell you." His brow furrowed, concern flickering in his eyes. "What is it?" Emma took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she clenched them at her sides. "Not here. Can we talk somewhere private?" Dylan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course." They walked in silence back to his car, the air between them thick with tension. Emma's mind raced, the words she needed to say battling against the fear of what might happen once they were spoken. As they drove, she stared out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of color. She had kept her secret for so long, shielding herself from the consequences of the truth. But now with Dylan, it felt impossible to keep it hidden any longer. The drive to Dylan's penthouse was quiet, the tension between them palpable. Emma sat rigidly in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she stared out the window. Her thoughts raced, each one louder than the last. She had come so close to telling him before, but now that the moment was here, her fear felt insurmountable. Dylan stole a glance at her as they waited at a red light. Her usual composure seemed to have vanished, replaced by an uneasiness that unsettled him. He wanted to say something to reassure her, but he sensed that whatever was weighing on her needed to come out on her terms. When they arrived, Dylan led her into his penthouse, the expansive space lit by the soft glow of city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Emma had been here before, but tonight it felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves were bracing for what was to come. "Can I get you something? Water? Wine?" Dylan asked, his tone tentative. Emma shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No thanks." He nodded, gesturing for her to sit on the plush sofa in the living room. She perched on the edge, her posture tense. Dylan sat across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You said there was something you needed to tell me," he prompted gently. "Take your time." Emma's eyes flicked up to meet his, her chest tightening at the concern etched on his face. She looked away quickly, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. I don't even know where to start," she admitted, her voice trembling. "It's complicated." "Start anywhere," Dylan said. "I'm here." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "You've been so kind to me, Dylan. More than anyone's been in a long time. And I've been keeping something from you, something I should have told you a long time ago." Dylan's brow furrowed, but he didn't interrupt. He could see how difficult this was for her. "I haven't been completely honest about who I am," Emma continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "About my past." Dylan's heart sank slightly, though he kept his expression neutral. "Okay," he said slowly. "What do you mean?" Emma hesitated, her gaze fixed on her hands. "My real name isn't Emma Carter. It's Emma Hastings." Dylan froze, the name striking a chord in his memory. Hastings. It was a name he knew all too well, a name tied to one of the most bitter rivalries of his business career. "Hastings," he repeated, his voice low. "As in Hastings Enterprises." Emma nodded, her face pale. "My father is Richard Hastings." Dylan's jaw tightened, a storm of emotion swirling within him. Richard Hastings was more than just a rival. He was a man who had tried to sabotage Dylan's company on more than one occasion. Their feud was infamous in business circles, a clash of egos and ambitions that had left deep scars on both sides. "I left my family years ago," Emma said quickly, as if sensing his thoughts. I couldn't be part of what they were doing, what my father was doing. I didn't agree with his methods, the way he treated people. So I walked away. Dylan stared at her, his mind racing. He wanted to believe her, to trust that her words were genuine, but the connection to Richard Hastings was impossible to ignore. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Emma's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Because I was afraid. Afraid that you'd see me as his daughter, and nothing more. That you'd think I was like him." Dylan leaned back, running a hand through his hair. He didn't know what to think, what to feel. The woman sitting in front of him, the woman he had come to care for, was tied to the man who had made his life hell for years. "Dylan," Emma said, her voice breaking. "I'm not my father. I spent my whole life trying to be the opposite of him. But I understand if you can't see past that." He looked at her, the vulnerability in her expression cutting through his anger and confusion. She wasn't Richard Hastings. She was Emma, who worked tirelessly at a fast food job, who had a sharp wit and a kind heart. Emma, who had never once tried to exploit his wealth or connections. "I don't know what to say," Dylan admitted finally. "This is a lot to process." "I know," Emma said, wiping a tear from her cheek. "And I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner. But I didn't want to lose you." Dylan sighed, his emotions warring within him. He wanted to pull away, to shield himself from the complications her revelation had brought. But he also couldn't ignore the connection they had built, the way she had changed him in such a short time. "I need time," he said finally, "to think." Emma nodded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand." Dylan stood, walking to the window to stare out at the city lights. He heard Emma rise behind him, her footsteps hesitant. "I'll go," she said softly. "I don't want to make this harder for you." He turned to her, his chest tightening at the sight of her tear-streaked face. He wanted to reach out, to tell her everything would be okay, but the words wouldn't come. "Good night, Dylan," she whispered before slipping out the door. As the penthouse fell silent, Dylan stood alone, the weight of her confession pressing down on him. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same. The days that followed were a blur for Dylan. He threw himself into his work, attending back-to-back meetings and finalizing deals with a single-minded focus that left his colleagues in awe. On the surface, he seemed as sharp and composed as ever, but beneath the facade, his mind was consumed by thoughts of Emma. Her confession had turned his world upside down. He couldn't reconcile the woman he had come to care for with the daughter of Richard Hastings, a man who had spent years trying to destroy everything Dylan had built. Yet, when he thought of Emma, her strength, her wit, her kindness, he struggled to see her as anything other than herself. She wasn't her father, and everything about her seemed to contradict the ruthless legacy of the Hastings name. Still, doubt lingered. Had she approached him knowing who he was? Was her interest in him genuine, or had it been part of some elaborate plan? These questions haunted him, their answers just out of reach. It wasn't until the third night that Dylan decided he couldn't let things end the way they had. He needed answers, not just to clear his own mind, but to understand Emma and the truth she carried. Ignoring the late hour, he grabbed his coat and left his penthouse, the streets below alive with the hum of the city. Emma sat alone in her small apartment, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminating the worn furniture and sparse decor. She hadn't slept much since leaving Dylan's place, her mind replaying their conversation over and over. She had expected his reaction. How could she not? But it didn't make the pain of his hesitation any easier to bear. The knock at her door startled her, breaking the stillness of the night. She hesitated, her heart pounding as she rose to answer. When she opened it, Dylan stood there, his expression unreadable. "Dylan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said simply, his tone firm but not unkind. Emma stepped aside to let him in, her hands trembling as she closed the door behind him. He stood in the center of the room, looking around briefly before turning to face her. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady, "about everything you told me. About you." Emma nodded, bracing herself for whatever came next. And I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter. Your father and I, what he's done, it's a lot to process. But I also know that you're not him." Her breath caught, her chest tightening as she tried to gauge his meaning. "Dylan, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "You could have stayed silent. You could have kept your secret and let me believe whatever I wanted to believe. But you didn't. That tells me something." It tells me that you're not the kind of person who plays games or manipulates people. It tells me that you're honest. And that matters more to me than your last name." Tears welled in Emma's eyes, but she held them back, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't know how to tell you." "I get that," Dylan said, his expression softening. "And I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I don't want to lose what we have because of something you didn't choose." Emma felt her defenses crumbling, the walls she had spent years building falling away. "Dylan, I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you." "Yes, you do," he said firmly. "You deserve someone who sees you for who you are, not where you come from." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then slowly, Dylan reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. "So, tell me, Emma. Tell me everything. No more secrets." She hesitated, the weight of her past pressing down on her, but the trust in his eyes gave her the strength to begin. She told him about her childhood, growing up in the shadow of her father's ambition. About the moment she realized the lengths Richard Hastings would go to in order to win, no matter the cost. About the day she walked away, leaving behind a life of privilege to forge her own path. By the time she finished, the weight she had carried for so long felt lighter. Dylan listened without interrupting, his gaze never leaving hers. When she was done, he let out a slow breath, nodding as if piecing it all together. "I can't imagine what that must have been like," he said finally. "But I'm glad you told me." Emma looked at him, her heart full of a mix of hope and fear. "Does it change how you see me?" Dylan shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It changes how I understand you. But it doesn't change how I feel." A tear slipped down Emma's cheek, and she let out a shaky laugh. "You really are something, Dylan Cole." "So are you Emma Hastings," he replied. Their conversation that night marked a turning point, but it was only the beginning. The road ahead was fraught with challenges, not least of which was the looming presence of Richard Hastings. Emma's decision to leave her family had severed ties, but she knew her father well enough to realize he wouldn't take kindly to her involvement with Dylan. As the days passed, Dylan and Emma worked to navigate the complexities of their relationship, their connection growing stronger despite the odds. But it wasn't long before the shadow of Richard Hastings cast a darker pall over their lives. The days that followed were a blur for Dylan. He threw himself into his work, attending back-to-back meetings and finalizing deals with a single-minded focus that left his colleagues in awe. On the surface, he seemed as sharp and composed as ever, but beneath the facade, his mind was consumed by thoughts of Emma. Her confession had turned his world upside down. He couldn't reconcile the woman he had come to care for with the daughter of Richard Hastings, a man who had spent years trying to destroy everything Dylan had built. Yet, when he thought of Emma, her strength, her wit, her kindness, he struggled to see her as anything other than herself. She wasn't her father, and everything about her seemed to contradict the ruthless legacy of the Hastings name. Still, doubt lingered. Had she approached him knowing who he was? Was her interest in him genuine, or had it been part of some elaborate plan? These questions haunted him, their answers just out of reach. It wasn't until the third night that Dylan decided he couldn't let things end the way they had. He needed answers, not just to clear his own mind, but to understand Emma and the truth she carried. Ignoring the late hour, he grabbed his coat and left his penthouse, the streets below alive with the hum of the city. Emma sat alone in her small apartment, the soft glow of a single lamp illuminating the worn furniture and sparse decor. She hadn't slept much since leaving Dylan's place, her mind replaying their conversation over and over. She had expected his reaction. How could she not? But it didn't make the pain of his hesitation any easier to bear. The knock at her door startled her, breaking the stillness of the night. She hesitated, her heart pounding as she rose to answer. When she opened it, Dylan stood there, his expression unreadable. "Dylan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," he said simply, his tone firm but not unkind. Emma stepped aside to let him in, her hands trembling as she closed the door behind him. He stood in the center of the room, looking around briefly before turning to face her. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady, "about everything you told me. About you." Emma nodded, bracing herself for whatever came next. And I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter. Your father and I, what he's done, it's a lot to process. But I also know that you're not him." Her breath caught, her chest tightening as she tried to gauge his meaning. "Dylan, let me finish," he interrupted gently. You could have stayed silent. You could have kept your secret and let me believe whatever I wanted to believe. But you didn't. That tells me something. It tells me that you're not the kind of person who plays games or manipulates people. It tells me that you're honest. And that matters more to me than your last name. Tears welled in Emma's eyes, but she held them back, her voice trembling as she spoke. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't know how to tell you. I get that, Dylan said, his expression softening. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I don't want to lose what we have because of something you didn't choose. Emma felt her defenses crumbling, the walls she had spent years building falling away. Dylan, I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you. Yes, you do, he said firmly. You deserve someone who sees you for who you are, not where you come from. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then slowly, Dylan reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. So, tell me, Emma. Tell me everything. No more secrets. She hesitated, the weight of her past pressing down on her, but the trust in his eyes gave her the strength to begin. She told him about her childhood, growing up in the shadow of her father's ambition. About the moment she realized the lengths Richard Hastings would go to in order to win, no matter the cost. About the day she walked away, leaving behind a life of privilege to forge her own path. By the time she finished, the weight she had carried for so long felt lighter. Dylan listened without interrupting, his gaze never leaving hers. When she was done, he let out a slow breath, nodding as if piecing it all together. I can't imagine what that must have been like, he said finally. But I'm glad you told me. Emma looked at him, her heart full of a mix of hope and fear. Does it change how you see me? Dylan shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It changes how I understand you. But it doesn't change how I feel. A tear slipped down Emma's cheek, and she let out a shaky laugh. You really are something, Dylan Cole. So are you Emma Hastings, he replied. Their conversation that night marked a turning point, but it was only the beginning. The road ahead was fraught with challenges, not least of which was the looming presence of Richard Hastings. Emma's decision to leave her family had severed ties, but she knew her father well enough to realize he wouldn't take kindly to her involvement with Dylan. As the days passed, Dylan and Emma worked to navigate the complexities of their relationship, their connection growing stronger despite the odds. But it wasn't long before the shadow of Richard Hastings cast a darker pall over their lives. Emma's fears became reality sooner than either of them had anticipated. Dylan received an uninvited visitor at his office, a courier carrying an envelope marked with the Hastings family crest. Inside was a letter, handwritten in a precise, deliberate script that Dylan recognized instantly. Dylan, it seems you've taken an interest in someone who belongs to me. While I commend your audacity, I feel it's my responsibility to remind you of the boundaries that have long existed between us. You would do well to remember where your loyalties lie and to reconsider your current path. Richard Hastings. Dylan's jaw tightened as he reread the letter, its veiled threat clear. He could practically hear Hastings's voice, laced with condescension and menace. For a moment, he debated throwing the letter away, but instead, he folded it carefully and slid it into his desk drawer. This wasn't a battle he would back down from, not when Emma's happiness and safety were at stake. That evening, he met Emma at a small, unassuming cafe. She looked up as he walked in, her face lighting up briefly before her expression shifted to concern. She could tell immediately that something was wrong. What happened? She asked as he sat down across from her. Dylan hesitated, his hand brushing over the pocket where the letter rested. Your father knows, he said simply. Emma's face paled, and she leaned back in her chair. What do you mean? I got a letter from him today. It wasn't subtle, Dylan replied. He's trying to scare me off. Emma closed her eyes, a heavy sigh escaping her. I knew this would happen. I told you he wouldn't let this go. Dylan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. Let him try. I'm not afraid of him. You should be, Emma said, her voice trembling. You don't know what he's capable of. I know enough, Dylan said firmly. But Emma, this isn't just about him. It's about us. And I'm not letting him dictate my choices. She looked at him, her eyes filled with both fear and admiration. Dylan, he'll come after you, your business, your reputation. He doesn't care who he hurts. Then we'll face him together, Dylan said. You've already shown him you're not afraid to walk away. That's more courage than most people ever show him. Emma wanted to believe him, but the memories of her father's ruthlessness were hard to shake. She squeezed Dylan's hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," he said, his tone resolute. The tension between them grew as Richard Hastings made his presence known in more direct ways. Dylan's board began receiving anonymous tips about alleged irregularities in his business dealings, fabricated, of course, but damaging enough to sow doubt. News outlets picked up on the whispers, and soon, Dylan found himself fielding questions he had no easy answers for. Meanwhile, Emma began noticing unfamiliar cars parked near her apartment, their occupants always seeming to be just passing through. It wasn't hard to guess who had sent them. Her father's reach was vast, and his tactics were always the same, subtle intimidation designed to unnerve without leaving evidence. One evening, Emma found a note slipped under her door. It was short and to the point. "Come home before you make things worse." There was no signature, but none was needed. She brought the note to Dylan, her hand shaking as she handed it over. He read it in silence, his expression darkening with every word. "This ends now," he said, his voice like steel. "I won't let him do this to you." "He's not going to stop," Emma said, her voice breaking. "Dylan, maybe it's better if we—" "Don't," Dylan interrupted, his tone sharp but not unkind. "Don't even think about giving him the satisfaction of driving us apart." Emma looked at him, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't want to lose you, Dylan. But I don't want you to get hurt because of me." "You won't lose me," Dylan said firmly. "And I'm not going anywhere." The breaking point came at a charity gala Dylan had been invited to attend. It was an event he typically avoided. He preferred quieter forms of philanthropy, but this time he decided to go. It wasn't long before he spotted Richard Hastings across the room, surrounded by a cluster of wealthy donors who hung on his every word. Dylan clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to confront him then and there. Instead, he bided his time, waiting for a moment when Hastings was alone. It came just as the night was winding down, when most of the guests had left or were saying their goodbyes. "Richard," Dylan said, his voice calm but laced with authority. "We need to talk." Hastings turned, a smirk playing at his lips. "Dylan Cole, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "You know exactly why I'm here," Dylan replied. "This ends now. Whatever game you're playing, it's over." Hastings chuckled, his tone dripping with condescension. "You've always been bold, I'll give you that. But you're out of your depth, boy. You think you can protect her from me?" "I don't think I know," Dylan said. "Emma is her own person. She's not a pawn in your games, and I won't let you treat her like one." Hastings' smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "You're making a mistake, Cole. She's a Hastings, whether she wants to admit it or not. And that means she'll always be tied to me." "Maybe in name," Dylan said, stepping closer, "but not in spirit. She's stronger than you'll ever be, Richard. And no matter what you do, you won't take that away from her or from us." For the first time, Hastings seemed genuinely unsettled. But before he could respond, Dylan turned and walked away, his resolve unshaken. Back at his penthouse, Dylan recounted the confrontation to Emma, who listened with equal parts gratitude and fear. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," Dylan replied. "Because this isn't just about us. It's about standing up to him, to everything he represents." Emma leaned into him, her head resting against his chest. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. Together, they were stronger than Richard Hastings' schemes. And together, they would find a way to overcome whatever came next. In the weeks that followed, the tides began to shift. Dylan and Emma worked together to counteract the pressure Richard Hastings had been applying. Dylan's team of lawyers and public relations experts dismantled the baseless allegations against his company, turning the narrative back in his favor. Meanwhile, Emma found strength in her growing support network. Dylan's friends and allies welcomed her with open arms, showing her that she didn't have to face her father's intimidation alone. But Richard wasn't done yet. His final play came in the form of a public appearance, an exclusive business forum where both Dylan and Richard were invited to speak. The event was covered by major news outlets, and tensions were high as both men prepared to face each other on a national stage. The conference room buzzed with anticipation as Richard Hastings took the podium. His speech was calculated and smooth, filled with veiled remarks that painted him as a benevolent leader while subtly discrediting Dylan's business practices. The audience nodded along, seemingly unaware of the hidden barbs in his words. When it was Dylan's turn, he walked to the podium with quiet confidence. He adjusted the microphone and began to speak, his voice steady and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, "I'd like to thank Mr. Hastings for his insight. It's always enlightening to hear from someone with such a long-standing presence in our industry." A ripple of polite laughter swept through the room, but Dylan's expression remained serious. "However, I believe we're here today not to tear each other down, but to discuss how we can build a better future. And that's something I've come to understand on a very personal level." He glanced toward the audience, his eyes finding Emma, who was seated in the back. Her presence gave him strength, and he continued, his words carrying more weight. "In the past few months, I've learned that the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't measured in profits or market share. It's measured in the people we uplift, the lives we change." The room fell silent, captivated by his sincerity. Dylan spoke about his journey, about the challenges he'd faced not just as a businessman, but as a person striving to do what's right. He didn't mention Richard directly, but the subtext was clear. Dylan was drawing a line in the sand, standing firmly against the kind of ruthless tactics Richard embodied. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. Even those who had been skeptical of Dylan's character seemed moved by his words. Richard, seated in the front row, maintained his composure, but his clenched jaw betrayed his frustration. The tide had turned, and he knew it. After the event, Dylan and Emma stepped outside into the cool evening air. The tension of the day began to melt away as they walked hand in hand, the city lights casting a soft glow around them. "You were incredible in there," Emma said, her voice filled with pride. "I meant every word," Dylan replied. "And I couldn't have done it without you." Emma stopped, turning to face him. "Dylan, I've spent so much of my life running from my past, trying to prove that I'm not like my father. But you've shown me that I don't have to do it alone, that I can face him and anything else that comes my way, with you by my side." Dylan smiled, his hand cupping her cheek. "You're not like him, Emma. You never were. And I'll remind you of that every day if I have to." Tears filled her eyes, but this time, they were tears of relief and gratitude. "I love you, Dylan." "I love you too," he said, his voice steady and full of conviction. The weeks turned into months, and together, Dylan and Emma built a life founded on trust, resilience, and love. They established a charitable foundation, using their resources to support causes that reflected their shared values: education, community building, and opportunities for those in need. Richard Hastings' influence began to wane as his underhanded tactics were exposed, thanks in part to Emma's bravery in coming forward with the truth about his methods. While he remained a looming figure in the background, his ability to control Emma's life had been broken. As they stood on the balcony of their shared home one evening, looking out at the city skyline, Emma leaned into Dylan's side, her hand resting on his chest. "Do you think he'll ever stop?" she asked softly. "Maybe," Dylan said. "But even if he doesn't have the power to touch what we've built. Not anymore." Emma smiled, the weight of her past finally lifting. For the first time in years, she felt free to love, to dream, to live. And as Dylan held her close, he knew that together, they could face whatever challenges the future held. Because what they had wasn't just love. It was a partnership built on courage, honesty, and the unwavering belief that they were stronger together than they could ever be apart. Their story wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its scars, but it was theirs, and that made it worth everything.